Exactly. In 1994, when the oppressive practices of apartheid ended, people's brains didn't immediately change. White people were still associated with dominance and marginalization, even though things had theoretically changed. When people who were raised in apartheid interacted with each other, there was an unconscious restabilizing of power differentials and an eliciting of old patterns and of adaptation. The white teachers felt comfortable speaking up and leading, the black teachers sat back, avoided conflict, and complied with suggestions they didn't necessarily support. This led to big problems at the school, and yet when I talked to the white teachers, they would sincerely say that racism was not playing a role in the issues at the school. One of the hardest things to grasp about implicit bias and racism is that your beliefs and values do not always drive your behavior. These beliefs and values are sorted in the highest, most complex part of your brain, the cortex. But other parts of your brain can make associations distorted, inaccurate, racist associations. The same person can have very sincere anti racist beliefs but still have implicit biases that result in racist comments or actions. Understanding sequential processing in the brain is essential to grasping this, as is appreciating the power of developmental experiences to load the lower parts of our brain with all kinds of associations that create our worldview. Oprah. We hear so many white people say, "Nobody ever used the N word in my house." But it's not just a matter of language, it's how you see your parents treat people who are not like you. It's how you see them in their interactions with other people. It's what is sad about them. It's the emotional tone that comes through in your household about people who are other. That is what you're taking in from the time you're born, so it shapes how you see people who aren't like you. Whether somebody used the N word or didn't use the N word isn't the point. There are a lot more influences at work. Dr. Perry, many more. When you are young and you are forming your primary associations about how the world works, your major influences come from your parents. And not really what they say, but how they act. You are so influenced by the other children and adults around you. If you are a white child who spends no time with children of color, you don't have any personal experiences to help build those important relational associations. We are also profoundly influenced by the media. From infancy, the media images we see shape our understanding of the world. For many white people, their only experience or perception of people of color is through the media. When I was growing up, the media was permeated with negative stereotypes about black people. I know lots of white people who, until they met me, had never known a black person. And there was a time when some white people actually had black people working for them, so they could say they knew one. But as you say, for many white people, their only association with black people was what they saw on the news and the movies. When I was young, black men and black youth in movies or on TV were much more likely to be portrayed in a negative way as a criminal, for example. They weren't the detectives, superheroes, scientists. This distortion has an incredibly powerful impact on the way our brain organizes. It contributes to the negative associations white people create about people of color. It is a big part of creating implicit bias. We all create our own version of the world that has distortions. As I said, the brain's shortcuts in processing information makes us vulnerable to bias. Everybody has some form of implicit bias, some distortion of the world. That's based on how and where they grew up. Imagine the odds of having every single culture and every single religion and every single ethnicity become part of your safe and familiar catalog, let alone being exposed to all that in the first few years of life. And so we need to acknowledge that we all carry some of these things around. In Isabel Wilkerberg's book Caste, she quotes a study from a criminal justice reform organization called the Sentencing Project. They found that crimes involving a black suspect and a white victim make up only 10% of all crimes, but they account for 42% of what's reported on television. When you are watching the news and almost half of what you see is black people committing crimes against white people, that's going to influence the way you think when you see a black person. Let's take a moment to think of how that implicit bias plays a role in an interaction between an inexperienced white cop in a confrontation with a black teenager late at night. It's a matter of state-dependent functioning. Under threat, the reasoning part of the brain starts to shut down and the more reactive emotional parts of the brain take over. Say you are the white cop and you feel threatened and you have a gun. If the lower, more reactive parts of your brain start to dominate your cognitions and behaviors when you feel under threat, and your brain has a whole catalog of black men as threatening criminals, you are much more likely to engage in fear-based behavior, yelling, escalating, pulling a trigger with a black teen than with a white teen. Your brain isn't filled with a catalog of threatening white teens. Talk about a system that needs trauma training. Law enforcement should be at the top of the list. Training about trauma, the brain, stress, and distress is essential if you are going to be a first responder, especially a police officer. Anyone given the responsibility of carrying a gun in service of society should have extensive training in these things. But there is a difference between implicit bias and racism. Where do you see that line? Implicit bias suggests that the bias is present but not plainly expressed, sometimes even unintentionally expressed. Racism, on the other hand, is an actual overt set of beliefs about the superiority of one race over others. In the United States, racism is the marginalization and oppression of people of color by systems created by white men to privilege white people. You could say that racism is embedded in the top rational part of your brain, whereas implicit bias involves the distorting filters created in lower parts of the brain. When a child or youth is exposed to overt racist beliefs, possibly in their home or peer groups, those beliefs can become embedded in the filters. The result can be a deeply ingrained set of feelings and beliefs that cut across multiple regions of the brain. Change, however, is possible. I think it's important to bring up a conversation I had in 2018 that confirmed my belief that through compassion there is hope for even the most racist individual to evolve. I spoke with a man named Anthony Ray Hinton who had spent 30 years on death row in Alabama for a crime he didn't commit. The prison setup was extremely isolating. Just him alone in his cell, unable to see any of the other inmates on the row with him. No one really talked to each other, but at night you could hear crying and moaning, men in pain. One night, Anthony heard someone crying and something inside him shifted. He called out, "What's wrong?" and the man told him that his mother had died. Now, Anthony was extremely close to his own mother, and in that moment he empathized. And that one question, that act of compassion opened the door for all the men. They began talking to each other regularly, sharing stories, even giving each other support. Anthony became particularly friendly with a man named Henry, and he eventually learned that his friend Henry was Henry Hayes, a member of the KKK who had been imprisoned for hanging a young black boy. But instead of cutting him off and ending the friendship, Anthony formed a bond with him on death row and they remained close friends. Dr. Perry: I would bet that by doing that, Anthony was able to also change Henry. So much so that on the night Henry was electrocuted, his last words were that all of his life he had gotten it wrong, his parents had taught him wrong, that black people were the enemy, and he had to come to death row to learn what love was. Wow, that's incredibly powerful and a perfect example of how even the most hateful racist belief system can be changed. Remember that the cortex is the most malleable, the most changeable part of the brain. Beliefs and values can change. Implicit bias is trickier to change, right? Implicit bias is much more difficult. You may truly believe that racism is bad, that all people are equal, but those beliefs are in the intellectual part of your brain, and your implicit biases, which are in the lower part of your brain, will still play out every day in the way you interact with others, the jokes you laugh at, the things you say. It is interesting to watch how this relates to the Black Lives Matter moment. In the wake of the murder of George Floyd, so many conversations have been sparked about structural racism, implicit bias, and white privilege. This has illuminated so much misunderstanding and resulted in so much expressed pain, and of course, so much defensiveness. I have never been a racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body. Well, the issue isn't your bones, it's your brain. All of us have deeply ingrained biases, and lurking among these are racist associations. The challenge of addressing implicit bias is first recognizing that you have it. Reflect on when your biases have been expressed. Anticipate when and where you may be likely to express your bias. Be courageous enough to spend time with people who are different from you and who may challenge your biases. It can be uncomfortable, but remember, moderate, predictable, controllable stress can build resilience. Create new associations, have new experiences. Ideally, you go out into the community and spend time with people who are different than you are. You need to create real, meaningful relationships so that you get to know individuals based on their unique qualities, not based on categories. That's what really changes both implicit bias and racism. Exactly. And this is why you can't be in a corporation and address these issues by simply having everyone go to an anti-racism course or cultural sensitivity training. You don't get trained in cultural sensitivity. You go spend time immersed in the culture, spend time with other people. Anthony Bourdain was a great example of this. He encouraged people to experience other cultures by spending time with the cooks, preparing the meals, eating the food, celebrating cultural events with the people who celebrate them. You can't become culturally sensitive from a 3-hour seminar. Thank you. I hope you liked this reading session and I hope this was peaceful.